Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission is more relevant than ever. Thanks to our sponsors and supporters. At the Platinum level, AT&T, Charter Communications, Consumer Technology Association, iHeartMedia, LG Electronics USA, Tegna, Verizon Communications, and Viacom CBS. Our gold sponsors include America's public television stations, CTIA, Everything Wireless, Education Networks of America, Interactive Advertising Bureau, National Association of Broadcasters, Comcast NBC Universal, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Silver sponsors include ACA Connects, America's Communications Association, the Advanced Television Systems Committee, ATSC, Cooley LLP, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Covington and Burling LLP, Cox Enterprises Inc., Davis Wright Tremaine LLP, DLA Piper, Fox Corporation, Lorman Center PLLC, News Media Alliance, T-Mobile, U.S. Telecom, Wiley, and Wilkinson Barker Nauer LLP. Thanks to all for making today's event possible. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kapler.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to our final Communications Forum virtual luncheon of 2021. Thank you for being with us today. We're very honored to have FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr joining us for a fireside chat with Dick Wiley. But before I introduce them, I'd like to extend a special thank you to our sponsors. As you can imagine, this has been another very challenging year for the Media Institute. We're extremely grateful to you, our luncheon sponsors, for your outstanding support this year. Last December, we thought we'd be back in person by now, but we stayed virtual as the pandemic situation continued to unfold. Thanks to your support of our virtual format, we were able to bring you some outstanding speakers from government and industry, including 3 FCC commissioners. And here we are today at our season finale. We're looking forward to our 2022 luncheon series, which will kick off in February. We'll see how conditions look early in the year, but we're certainly expecting to be back in person when the time is right in 2022. We can't wait to be back together with you. Meanwhile, please keep this luncheon series in your 2022 budget. We'll send out sponsorship renewals in the near future, and we look forward to having you back. We're counting on your support. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's program. As I mentioned, we're going to have a fireside chat hosted by our own Dick Wiley. As you know, Dick is a former FCC chairman and is the Media Institute's chairman of the board. We're grateful to Dick for serving as our host today. Our guest is FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, who has served as a commissioner since 2017 and is now in his second term. Commissioner Carr joined the FCC as a staffer in 2012 and later served as general counsel. Prior to joining the agency, he was an attorney at Wiley Ryan LLP in the firm's appellate litigation and telecom practices. Before that, he clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Commissioner Carr is a graduate of Georgetown University and graduated magna cum laude from the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law, where he served as an editor of the Catholic University Law Review. At the FCC, Commissioner Carr has become known as the 5G Crusader. He's also been a champion of expanding America's workforce to build out 5G infrastructure. In addition, he's been leading an FCC Telehealth initiative to bring high-quality healthcare to low-income Americans and veterans. Let me remind our viewers that during our fireside chat, you'll have a chance to ask questions using the Ask a Question feature on your screen. Just type your questions and send them in. After their conversation, Dick Wiley will have a good Q&A session with Commissioner Carr based on your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, and our chairman of the board, Mr. Dick Wiley.
Thank you, Rick, and welcome, Commissioner. Why don't we get right to the questions? Commissioner, the road to 5G has always been one of your primary interests, both as to spectrum availability and infrastructure reform. How do you think the United States stands today in concerning competition with other nations, especially China?
Well, I think we're in great shape. And first of all, obviously, thank you to Chairman Wiley, to Rick Kaplar, to the organization for giving me the chance to join you all for your last roundtable of the year. It's always great to be with Chairman Wiley. It's not because he's famous or because he's successful. It's because he's famous and successful. And being around him certainly lifts my reputation up significantly. And I actually owe a lot personally to Mr. Wiley. Back in 2003, he took a risk on a scrappy 2L law student who had significantly more hair than I have right now, and gave me an offer to join his firm as a summer associate. And that was a start of just a wild and rewarding career in telecom. And if I hadn't gotten that offer and started with his firm and was mentored by Mr. Wiley and the great lawyers that he has there, my life certainly would not have taken the path that it's been on since then. So very grateful for his friendship, his mentorship over the years. I remember to this day walking into your office every year for the associate evaluation. You'd have to stand outside the door. It would open up. You'd be sitting behind the desk, sort of vigorously scribbling. I never knew what you were scribbling, but you're always scribbling something. And then you would pronounce the verdict on whether you had a good year or a bad year. But back to the question at hand. Yeah, I think we're in great shape. I mean, if you look back, and I've said this a few times, but back in 2015 or 2016, I think there was a real serious question mark about U.S. leadership in 5G. And I think that was the case for a couple of reasons. One, China looked at the leadership that the U.S. demonstrated in 4G. They saw Silicon Valley. They saw economic opportunity. They saw the whole app economy built principally in the U.S. because our world-leading 4G network attracted all that investment, all of those jobs, all that opportunity. And they wanted to be that for 5G. So they went ahead and did what the communist regime does and centrally planned their way, or attempted to centrally plan their way there. And back then, they were just blowing us away when it came to putting up new cell sites. They had hundreds of megahertz of spectrum, including mid-band spectrum available when we still were sort of stuck in neutral on that front. So we had some work to do, and we went to work. We modernized infrastructure rules. We put more spectrum out there, including mid-band spectrum, than we've ever done before. And that allowed the U.S. private sector to invest and to leapfrog our global counterparts. And today, the good news is we have the strongest 5G platform in the world, and we have the culture of innovation here that's creating the use cases that's really going to make the 5G network meaningful to American consumers and to consumers worldwide. There's some naysayers out there. I saw the former Google head, Eric Schmidt, had another Wall Street Journal op-ed recently saying the U.S. is falling behind in 5G. I think he puts those same op-eds out about every 6 months for reasons I haven't quite identified, but I think he's sort of the Chicken Little of 5G leadership. But the news is infrastructure builds in this country have been booming. We've got more spectrum out there. Providers are ahead of their own schedules, aggressive schedules for 5G builds. So it's a good thing. And I think, look, when people look at 4G, they look a lot at the sort of the whiz-bang applications, right? Going from having to go to a brick and mortar bank to getting, Venmo and Square on your phone, going from having to hail a taxi cab in the rain outside of a building to getting Uber, Lyft, and other apps. And I think in a lot of ways, consumers are sort of waiting. What is that killer 5G app? And we're still sort of, early in that development cycle. But one of the things that I focus on early on is competitive in-home broadband. And we're seeing that a lot of the first successful 5G use cases is going into consumers' homes and giving them another choice, a wireless choice that they believe is as competitive and meets their needs the way that a fixed connection, a wired connection would have. So I'm really happy with where we are in the pace of build. Of course, we can't rest on our laurels. We need more infrastructure reform. We need a lot more spectrum out there. But at the moment, we've played some pretty serious catch up, and I'm happy.
Well, you're right that the commission has a lot of large swaths of spectrum, particularly mid-band spectrum for 5G. But you've been saying recently more is going to be needed. Why is that so?
Yeah, I mean, look, the game plan for 5G is you need spectrum across every single spectrum band. You need low band, mid band, and high band. In a lot of ways, the US is one of the very few countries that is in position now and is increasingly in the position to say that we have a significant amount of spectrum across all three of those spectrum bands that are going to be key. At the beginning of the year, I laid out a spectrum calendar with my ideas for what we need to get done to match the pace and cadence of spectrum actions that we did under the last administration under the chairmanship of Ajit Pai. Maybe you heard of him. And in that calendar, I included things like, getting the 2.5 gigahertz auction across the finish line. I had put forward the idea of getting that done this year. I think we had teed that up for action with a early PN, I think at the beginning part of January. In the spectrum calendar that I put out there, I identified about 4 or 5 bands that I thought we should make progress on this year. Just starting a process, for instance, on potentially upping the power limits in CBRS was another one that I put out there. There's some actions in the 6 gigahertz band, whether it's VLP, what we call very low power, which I think could be key to unlocking a lot of those 5G use cases that people are looking at, whether it's virtual reality, augmented reality. I think low power device operation in 6 gigahertz could be one way to do that. Not to get too technical, but the Uni 2C band, which is a sort of historically underused Wi-Fi band, maybe that's another place we could authorize some of that very low power operation. So we got to keep going. Spectrum is the oxygen that's going to fuel 5G builds, 5G innovations. And so we made great progress over the last couple of years, but we got to keep going. And look, there's some headwinds, to be clear. I talked about this a couple of times, but we're sort of in a new era of spectrum policy, I think, where a lot of other agencies have very important missions that they're trying to get done, and they increasingly see spectrum as a key input to their getting their jobs done. That's great. That's welcome news. The problem is the way those agencies are going about trying to vindicate their spectrum interests. Going back to the 1930s, Congress made the decision to centralize at the FCC the decision-making over spectrum. And what we're seeing right now is a sort of a rejection of that, core purpose of the 1930s Communications Act. So the FCC runs a process. It's open, it's transparent. Every agency, you get to put your data in there, you get to put your evidence in there, you get due deference from the FCC for everything you put in the record. You're going to get a fair shake. And then the FCC, under the statutory structure established by Congress, makes the decision. And at that point, whether you like the decision or not, you had a fair shake. The music stops, and we move on with build out and deployment. And we're increasingly seeing agencies that are trying to dance well after the music stops. We see it obviously right now with the FAA on C-band. We see it with the Department of Transportation historically on 5.9. We saw it with NOAA with the weather radars in 24 gigahertz. We see it with DOD and Legato or lower 3. So I'm worried about the future trajectory of spectrum policy in this country. If a final decision by the FCC, if investments of billions of dollars by the private sector, we nonetheless then see other agencies engaging in post-music stopping ancillary attacks on the FCC's decision. I mean, look, you want to go to court. But I don't think it's a productive process to have agencies acting on their own, countermanding a decision when everyone had a fair shake on the front end. But not that I feel strongly about it.
Let's turn to the other side, the infrastructure side. You've led the effort to try to reduce site delays and perhaps fees, excessive fees at the state and local level. Are you satisfied with the progress to date? And how has all this helped us for the race to 5G with China and other nations?
Yeah, look, we've seen just an unprecedented boom in infrastructure builds. Again, going back to 2016, we had something like 708 new cell sites get built out in this country, and that number jumped to, depending on the estimate, I think 2019 it was 68,000 new cell sites. So just a huge boom in infrastructure builds, and that's been key. I mean, again, when COVID hit, we had all of those new cell sites online, bolstering network capacity, extending connections to Americans that wouldn't have had them without those infrastructure reforms. And we got to keep that going. Again, the playbook, 3G to 4G, 4G to 5G is the same. More infrastructure reforms and modernization, more spectrum. So there's more progress that we have to make on both fronts. And I'm worried because up to now, the administration's infrastructure plan appears to be simply throwing money. And that's great. We need more money. And at this point now, we've got more money. than the most aggressive estimates in terms of the dollars that we need to close the digital divide. What I'm worried about now is we're stepping on the gas and the brakes at the same time. We're giving all this funding while at the same time we're not necessarily engaging the same type of infrastructure modernization. And in some cases, depending on where we go with some regulations, we could be putting headwinds to those infrastructure builds. So if your infrastructure plan doesn't have a plan for more spectrum, doesn't have a plan for more infrastructure modernization, it's not that good of a plan. So yeah, we need more infrastructure modernization going forward. We got a lot done. I'm proud of that, but not mission accomplished on that front.
Commissioner, what's your view of ORAN, that is open access networks? Do you think that its development is going to help the United States become more competitive in this whole area?
Yeah, I'm excited about ORAN. I mean, I don't want to put sort of a heavy regulatory thumb on the scale. I think it's a technology that should be given a fair shot to succeed, and I want to see that happen. But I'm not, I'm not hired in this job to be a technologist that picks a particular type of technology and elevates it above all others. The thing that's interesting to me about ORAN is a couple things. One, it has the capacity, obviously, to drive down significantly the cost of network builds, which I think is good for everybody, right? So rather than having a single bespoke piece of hardware, expensive, that does one function, part of the idea with ORAN is we're going to have essentially dumber, cheaper boxes, pieces of hardware, and a lot of the brains are going to be at the software level. Now, that's not entirely right. I mean, obviously, we still need equipment. Software can't, turn radio signals and send them through the air. So we need hardware and components and antennas still, but it's that's the trend line. And it's going to result in, I think, a lot more innovation, and it's going to allow smaller players to participate in this space, right? So rather than where we were a couple of years ago, where we had, a CCP-backed Huawei and ZTE with lots of state investment in them, and needing those levels of R&D to compete in the equipment space. Now, coders and companies that rely principally on software without those multiple billions of dollars of investment can compete in the hardware and the equipment space. But look, we're a bit of a chicken and the egg point. There's some companies that are doing it and having success. There's other carriers that are hesitant. And I want, people to feel like ORAN is a choice, but not feel like the government's pressing them. And also, I think we got to be clear that we want a lot of companies to compete here. We've got national security concerns with respect to Huawei, ZTE, and other sort of entities that are closely aligned with communist China. But we need to make sure that other quote unquote foreign headquartered companies have a fair shot at competing in the ORAN space. We want there to be competition there. We don't necessarily want to say, for instance, that X percent of ORAN contracts need to go to U.S. headquartered business. I would love for them to succeed, but I want them to succeed on the merits.
We're talking a lot about 5G, but FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel and others have now said it's not too early to start talking about 6G. What's your view on this area?
It's almost too early. No, so what I think about that is we have so much running room left with 5G that obviously we walk and chew gum at the same time all the time on a ton of issues. So yeah, we should be thinking about 6G, but I don't want to do so to the exclusion of continuing to deliver results on 5G. So we still need infrastructure reforms to continue to make it easier to build out 5G networks, including on the wired side. There's more work we can do on pole attachments, for instance, among many other things. There's more spectrum that we can get out there. So we got to tend to our knitting, to throw out more analogies. We got to do the blocking and tackling. And I think keeping the FCC focused on what regulatory actions do we need to do to continue to bolster and support 5G is important. There's going to be technologists thinking about 6G. There's going to be spectrum talks about 6G. Maybe we got to get more into the terahertz spectrum range for that. So yeah, let's think a little bit about it, but let's not do so to the detriment of continuing to take needed actions to continue to get 5G going.
All right, let's turn to another area of great interest to you, and that is the delivery of telehealth, and particularly remote delivery of high quality care, even through smartphones and tablets. But what legal and regulatory connectivity changes may lie ahead in that regard?
Yeah, the work the FCC does on telehealth is really, really important to me. It's a passion of mine. I know sometimes it doesn't quite generate the headlines as much as when I sent a tweet about communist China or send a tweet about Section 230 reform. People get more interested in that stuff. But telehealth to me is in some ways above all that in terms of my interest at the FCC. And really the work we do here builds on the work of Commissioner Clyburn. I think she picked up the baton and was a strong leader for telehealth work in her time at the FCC. And what I saw was we were doing a lot of good work even before Commissioner Clyburn on connecting brick and mortar buildings to the internet. And that was our telehealth work. And that was great. But what I saw back in 2018 was this sort of new direction where it had been basically when you go through the glass doors of a hospital, you have access to high quality, high tech care on one side of the glass doors, and you go the other, and it's like you're in the Stone Age. You don't have any care. Maybe you can call your doctor, and that was about it. But we saw this new trend, to your point, where patients can now have apps on their smartphones. There's Bluetooth connected healthcare devices like blood glucose monitors. And I wanted to support that new trend towards whether you call it connected care or remote patient monitoring, because it's in many cases for many conditions like far better care because you are in constant contact, you're staying healthy rather than having a condition devolve to the point in which you need to be admitted to the emergency department. So it's better for the patient. It drives down healthcare costs. And so we started the slow plot of regulatory legwork needed to stand up this remote patient monitoring approach. And then obviously COVID-19 hit, and we had luckily really gotten that legwork done so we could stand up this emergency COVID-19 program, which was this connected care model. We also finished that connected care pilot, standing that up that I had talked about. The last about 2 years or so, I've met with 44 different healthcare providers in 22 different states. And I've heard firsthand about the patients that these health providers were able to see and treat and help because of these FCC programs. So it's been really heartening. Just this week, I did a roundtable with a lot of those awardees, including ones that I met, just so they could talk to each other, learn lessons from each other, and see how we can keep the momentum going. To your question, ultimately here, I'll get to it. To your question, there is more we can do. So one reason that telehealth was being held back pre-pandemic was not because the technology wasn't there, it was there. It wasn't necessarily because of patients not knowing how to use the technology. In fact, I think we've seen a lot fewer barriers in terms of people getting how to use this technology than what a lot of people would have thought, but it was regulations. We had licensing rules, reimbursement rules that created incentive structures for healthcare systems to prefer seeing people in person as opposed to seeing them remotely. And there was waivers issued by HHS and other legislative actions taken that fixed that during the pandemic, but all of that regulatory relief is set to expire when the pandemic declaration expires. And so it's easy to say we cannot go back to the pre-pandemic version of telehealth, but we very much can go back to the pre-pandemic version of telehealth if we don't lock in those regulatory changes. And there's some legislation in Congress that would do that. I think it's important we get that across the finish line, obviously before we lift the pandemic declaration, unless we never lift it, which is a possibility, and then those reforms will stay in place for a while.
Commissioner, as you know, rural health care is supported by universal service fund payments, along with several other services. But the contribution to the fund passed along to average citizens are now running over 30% of monthly long distance charges and may go even higher in the future. Yeah. What's the solution to this problem?
Well, you're right. Well, the good news is that 30% is going to come down a couple percentage points for this next quarter. So you get a little bit of relief, but not much. Look, the very first research project I ever did as a baby lawyer at Wiley Ryan, this was back in 2005 when I started as an associate, was to research the upward creep of the Usf contribution factor. Back then it was going from like 4.5% to 5%. And people thought, well, if it hits 6 or 7%, we're in a lot of trouble. Well, flash forward to today, and to your point, we're at around 30%. And there's some estimates that show that we could hit 75% in the next few years. We're in this death spiral. And that's because traditional telephone revenues are declining. So we have to increase the percentage charge to get the same amount of $9-10 billion. It's just not sustainable. And to your point, these programs do a lot of good work. And so what I put out there is this concept of a fair share, which is we look at the businesses, the enterprises that are benefiting from the investment of universal service dollars. And a lot of those dollars are going to connect rural communities with high-speed internet. And those networks are being used to deliver the products of large technology companies, whether it's streaming services from Disney Plus or Netflix, or whether it's the digital advertising services of Google and Facebook. And so my idea is pretty simple. Let's have them start paying a fair share. That's going to relieve the burden on consumers. It's going to create a sustainable model and make sure that those networks that all those companies are pulling trillions of dollars of revenue and benefit off are contributing into the USF, not contributing directly to an ISP, but contributing to the Universal Service Fund so that we can support those purposes that we all benefit from.
Commissioner, here's a question from the past, but might become a question for the future. And that is net neutrality going to return to the FCC's agenda again in 2022 or perhaps thereafter?
Yeah, if I was being cynical, I would say when it comes to net neutrality, it is all over except the yelling and the fundraising. But look, I got an open mind, and so I'm open to see what happens here. Yeah, look, I think it is basically largely baked in a lot of ways that we are going to head down the same path of at least debating Title II style net neutrality rules. I think that's a mistake. It is such an old debate of the past. These were ideas that were generated, in the mid to late 2000s that were acted on in various iterations, ultimately in 2014, 2015. And the reality is the greatest threat to a free and open internet is not your ISP, whether I describe it as the mom and pop ISP or whether other people describe it as Comcast or Verizon, AT&T behemoths. And we know that because just look at the last couple of years. And the last couple of years, the actions that have been taking place in terms of, blocking URLs, engaging in other discriminatory conduct is taking place at a different point in the internet stack. It's not at the ISP level. We're seeing it from large technology companies, whether it's Microsoft blocking search results for the Tiananmen Square tank man in the run up to one of the anniversaries of that, whether it was blocking the URL of the New York Post story in the run up to a presidential election. And so if your view is we need regulation to ensure that data freely flows over the internet, then I think that takes you to a different point in the stack than the Title II style net neutrality rules. At the same time, look, if we can take rate regulation off of the table, and I think a lot of Title II net neutrality is simply a stalking horse for that, then I don't think there's a lot of complications in terms of finding some sort of common sense, bright line rules that I think everybody would agree on at this point.
You'd go for a rule against blocking, throttling, and undue paid prioritization?
Yeah, look, what I've long said is there's two things going on here. There's bright line rules, and then there is the legal regulatory framework. In terms of like no blocking, no throttling, those types of bright line rules, I don't think there's a lot of controversy there. I think everybody is comfortable with that. The problem, obviously, back in the day was you had those bright line rules, and you sort of reclassified the internet under this broad Title II framework with vague rules. I think even those that were in favor of them have now conceded were sort of overly vague rules that injected a lot of uncertainty. And again, I think the main problem is that sweeping Title II regulation. And I think there's a lot of paths forward for some basic rules of the road that I think you could get bipartisan support for that doesn't involve Title II, that doesn't involve rate regulation.
Okay, let's turn to Section 230. Do you anticipate any congressional action in this area, perhaps changing the algorithms that target online activity or what people see?
I anticipate a lot of action. I don't anticipate a lot of past legislation. I mean, look, I think at its core, you got Republicans and Democrats pulling on opposite ends of a thread. I think to generalize, Republicans, I think, want to see less censorship, more speech. Democrats want to see more censorship, less speech. Maybe someone will have a different view than me, but I get to answer the question, so that's how I frame it. But I do think you're seeing some coalescence around privacy concerns, around harms to children. There could very well be paths forward around those issues, as well as transparency that do actually get translated into legislation. I mean, look, I have obviously long been a proponent of Section 230 reform. I think that is sort of table stakes, but it's not enough. I think that's the beginning. I think we need Section 230 reform. I think we need more transparency. And I think, and I've said this a lot, I think we need to impose affirmative anti-discrimination obligations on these large tech companies. And a lot of people have raised First Amendment concerns with that, and I'm very sensitive to that. My view is, there's a very strong case that we can move forward with affirmative anti-discrimination requirements on large technology companies entirely consistent with the First Amendment. In fact, I think if you look at some of the litigation out there already, I think a lot of these cases are analogizing to the wrong set of Supreme Court precedents. A lot of them are looking to Miami Herald, which is a very important First Amendment case, a newspaper case. And they're saying, the forced carrying of editorials wasn't allowed. Therefore, any regulation of content moderation for large technology companies doesn't survive scrutiny. And my view is you got to put the Supreme Court's First Amendment cases on a spectrum. And on one end, you got Miami Herald, which is a newspaper making very particular individualized decisions about what speech to carry, what speech not to carry. And every single content that goes onto that newspaper is that newspaper's speech. On the other end of the spectrum, you have cases that look much more what I would describe as conduit-like. So I put on the far end of the spectrum this way, the 2016 DC Circuit net neutrality case, actually, US Telecom case, which basically said in the face of a First Amendment challenge to those rules, we don't even think the First Amendment is implicated here, let alone run the analysis, implicated, because you are operating in a conduit-like manner. You're basically carrying the speech of others, which is very different than only carrying your own speech, again, on this side of the spectrum. So if you look at that, there's a number of cases in there. PG&E is on that spectrum, on the inside of the Miami Herald. I think you get Turner, the cable case, that's more on this side of the spectrum. I think a lot of ways Turner is the right analogy, and not because things factually haven't changed with respect to Turner itself, which I think they have, and I've spoken about that. But I think today, the way that large technology companies operate, it looks a lot more like the cable regime of the Turner era when the Supreme Court looked at it. In other words, there is some speech of the actual entity itself, the cable provider in that case, large technology company here, but there's also significant carrying of the speech of others. Obviously, we understand how that works with large technology companies. With cable, it's other independent channels. And yet the Supreme Court has allowed the regulation of the decision of what speech to carry and what speech not to in the cable case. This isn't to say that large technology companies and content moderation regulation is identical to the Turner situation. What it's to say is that if you put all the Supreme Court cases on the spectrum of, conduit-like on one end, individualized decisions on the other, the Supreme Court has allowed regulation of what to carry on this end. And my argument, and I'm trying to write this up, maybe I eventually will, is that there are regulations of large technology companies that look a whole lot more like the US Telecom case, like the Turner case, like Zauderer, like Pruneyard, permissible regulation of decisions of what to carry than the Miami Herald type of a case. But maybe one day I'll have time to sort of fully spin that out and write that up.
Okay, well, let me just go with one last question, then we're going to turn to the audience. As we see 5G being developed, we also see next-gen television, as you know. And do you see a natural interplay between these new technological services? And if so, how will the media and telecom providers be impacted?
I'm a big fan of HSC 3.0, even though it's a sort of a clunky term. And I've tried to use different terms to talk about it because I think it's such an interesting technology. I know it's branded as Next Gen TV, and people get mad when I don't use the official branding of Next Gen TV. But to me, the way I conceive of it is to just think of it as another, download pipe, another IP pipe. And so that's why I sort of refer to it more as sort of data casting or broadcast internet. And I think the networks of the future aren't going to be ones in which your upload and download are, not only not on the same spectrum, but they are going to not only be, they're going to be on entirely different technology. So for instance, what is the cheapest, most efficient way to get content down to a device, whether it's a vehicle or a smartphone or pre-positioning content for Netflix or Disney? It may very well be that the most efficient download pipe is going to be ATSC 3.0, and you can get the return path, the upload, from another technology. And so I'm really optimistic about it. And I think it's got a lot of running room, not just as next-gen TV, which is great, better volume control, better picture, that's great. But I think the real potential and upside of 3.0 is people just conceiving of it as another sort of download internet pipe. Okay.
All right, let's turn to some of the questions that we've had from the chat area. Commissioner, you have said that it's time to end big tech's free ride in regard to internet infrastructure. Can you elaborate on that and your proposed solution?
Yeah, this goes back to that sort of idea of a USF contribution reform, which is, rather than having that 30% assessment on consumers' telephone bill, and rather than assessing the internet by just taking that 30% and putting on the data portion of people's bill. I've said, let's take it off consumers' bill entirely and have large technology companies start to contribute. The most rifle shot way, I think, doing that is looking at digital advertising revenues. You could take a very small percentage of digital ad revenues and replace entirely that 30% charge. And I've actually been surprised. There's really good bipartisan support, including in Congress. And in fact, the FCC has been directed through this new infrastructure bill to look at a range of ideas on contribution reform. And I hope that's one that we include in the FCC's own look at this.
Okay. The FCC chairwoman has said again, the commission is going to look at carriage issues facing independent programmers. What can or should the FCC potentially do?
Look, this is an interesting issue. We haven't had a lot of progress on much of this, including if you look back sort of more broadly at media issues, including the Quad, which has been sort of stuck in some sort of regulatory purgatory for a while. And yeah, at some point, obviously, I think we got to take a look at these issues, do it with fresh eyes, make sure we understand, the modern media marketplace and how it operates.
All right. Does Jessica Rosenworcel's confirmation help plan to keep big tech to contribute? Well, we kind of covered that. Do you predict the Biden administration will favor that plan? That's the last part of that question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, Senator Lujan, the Democrat lead on the Senate Commerce, has expressed some favorable words with respect to it. And so I do think that we are hopefully coalescing around it. Look, there's some organizations that are going all in on assessing bias, broadband internet access service. I think that's a mistake. I don't know why we would artificially be raising the cost of broadband connectivity for consumers at a point in time when so many of us are focused on the affordability portion of getting the digital divide closed. So yeah, I think ideas like this one, maybe there's others out there, but ideas that involve filling up that USF $9 billion, not from consumer bias, are ones that we should be focused on.
One of the questions that have been asked on Capitol Hill is broadband maps, new broadband maps. They've been in the offing for some time. They're so crucial to helping to develop 5G and closing the digital divide. What's been the problem, the delay, and what's in the offing for the future?
Yeah, back in March, when I gave one of my speeches, I had called for the FCC to complete those maps by this fall. And judging by the weather, it's pretty cold. I think we're in the winter. I think we missed that fall deadline. But look, it's obviously a complicated process. The chairwoman has provided some recent updates on sort of the government contracting rules and regulations the FCC has to go through. But it's so important that we go fast on this, because that's the key to unlocking the 5G fund, unlocking, the second round of RDOF 2. And those maps are going to be absolutely critical for all this infrastructure spending, including the dollars coming out of NTIA. I mean, that's the only shot that we've got at avoiding, BTOP era waste, fraud, and abuse on steroids is if those dollars go through the FCC's map. And so we got to get that map done so it's not holding up those dollars that Congress has recently appropriated.
Let's talk about media for a moment. After 17 years, guess what? The Third Circuit Court of Appeals is finally out of the picture. Now, do you think, given that, the commission is likely to complete, perhaps in 2022, the 2018 quadrennial review of the broadcast ownership rules?
It feels like it's been going on since 1918. Yeah. I'll give you that much. Look, there's some precedent for rolling these things over. I think we did it in, was it 2010 or 2012? We rolled one into the other. Obviously, we're not doing anything between now and the end of the year. Whether we finish the 18 and 22, I don't have any insight on, but obviously we've got to get going on 22 at that point. So these may start to run together a little bit, but I don't have any sort of news to break per se on what, the chair's thinking. And obviously she's got, a lot in the air that she's working on in terms of timing and getting out the door.
Okay. As we move into the crypto era, how will FCC work with financial agencies and even EPA to oversee blockchain operations?
Yeah, hopefully not a lot. Hopefully we don't do a ton of work in the crypto blockchain area. I will say, one view that I've expressed when it comes to crypto is, as so much of the banking world, so much of the access to financial services moves into the digital era, I do think we've got to watch out for discrimination there. I think a lot of the concerns that I have about discriminatory conduct that large technology companies are engaging when it comes to social media is one level of problem. But if we start to push that into the digital realm and denying people, access to financial services based on the same criteria that they're denied ability to speak or be on these platforms, that would be disturbing to me.
Speaking of working with other agencies in the telehealth area, the question is, what's your outlook for collaborating with FDA, NIH, HHS, and other agencies that are involved in setting policies in this area?
We've been doing some good work there. The VA actually has been a real strong leader on telehealth services. I've visited a number of VA facilities that are doing telehealth across the country. I believe we have an agreement with them, an MOU of some sort with different agencies to make sure we are coordinated on telehealth. And it's going to be important because, look, we're the broadband experts. We have to know what we don't know, and we're not the telehealth experts. So as we have worked through, for instance, the connected care proceeding that I've been running, we've been had regular calls with counterparts in VA and other components of government, HHS, CMS, to make sure that we're aligned on these issues. And yeah, you're right. This is important that we stay together.
Well, Commissioner, I think we've covered the area and we've just about run out of time. Really appreciate your being with us as always, and an amazing scope of information you've learned since I jotted down those little things about you. And you didn't do that very well, but now you're doing it.
Improving.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Rick, let me turn it back to you.
Hey, thank you, Dick. And thanks for hosting such an insightful discussion today. Wonderful job. Commissioner Carr, thanks so much for being with us today. You always give us great insights and perspectives, and this kind of information we just have a hard time getting anywhere else. So thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. Really appreciate it. I want to thank all our sponsors. Thank you again for being with us today. Thanks to Dave Arland and his production team and John Taylor of LG Electronics. And we look forward to seeing all of you back here next February when we kick off our 2022 Luncheon series. So thank you again to everyone. We really appreciate your support this year during another difficult, challenging virtual year, but we made it through in great shape. Thanks to all of you great supporters out there. So we thank you. Meanwhile, thank you again for joining us today, and happy holidays.
Thank you to our guest speaker today. Thank you to the Navy Band, and a big thank you again to our sponsors. We'll see you next month.